Topping our news, the manager of a Columbus Dollar General store is dead tonight after police say a customer shot her after a small purchase, then later opened fire on police at a separate scene.
That would lead to an officer-involved shooting that left the suspect dead and a police officer and K-9 officer injured.
For a $1.58 transaction, a mother of three lost her life on June 23rd, 2026.
Two crumpled dollar bills sit on a counter, untouched. A woman's hand is reaching for them when the world stops. She never finishes the transaction. Somewhere in Columbus, Georgia, a police radio crackles to life with 4 words no officer wants to hear. Shots fired, officer down. But that call comes later. Right now, in this exact second, a mother of 3 is standing behind a cash register on a Tuesday morning that looks like every other Tuesday morning of her life. And she has no idea she's about to become a statistic in the most senseless kind of crime there is. He hands her the money. She starts to count it. That's it. That's the whole story of why she dies. No argument, no history, no warning, just a stranger, a small purchase, and a decision that had already been made before he ever walked through the door. By the time this is over, a police dog will be fighting for its life in an emergency room 2 states away. An officer will take a bullet to the face. And a man with 6 prior arrests and a pattern nobody stopped will be lying dead in the grass behind a plaza, taking every answer to why with him. But first, you need to understand who she was and exactly how little it took to end her. Welcome to Black Homicide Files. If you want the full case, not the 90-second clip the news ran, not the version that got cut for time, but every piece of what actually happened here, subscribe now. Because what comes next explains almost none of it, and that's exactly the problem. 44 years old, general manager, 3 sons. That's the version that ran in every headline. It's also the least interesting thing about her. Alexis Hill had run that Dollar General on Victory Drive long enough to stop being the manager to the people who came through it and start being Alexis, the woman who knew which regulars were short on cash before they said anything, who covered the register herself during the morning rush instead of pushing it onto a teenager working their first job. Retail management doesn't reward that kind of thing. It's a job built on being replaceable. Cover the shift, hit the numbers, move on. She ran it the opposite way. Her brother, Jonathan Hill, would later say she couldn't be replaced, not as a manager, as a person holding a family together. 3 boys, raised on a schedule built around double shifts and call-outs, on the version of stability you build by being the one person who never doesn't show up. Here's the detail that didn't make it into most of the coverage. Columbus Police Corporal Heather Hicks knew Alexis before any of this. Years before, Hicks had responded to a domestic violence call, not involving Alexis, but one of her employees. And in the middle of that call, in the middle of someone else's crisis, Hicks remembers Alexis as kind, generous, dependable. That's not a manager clocking in. That's someone whose staff mattered to her enough that a police officer still remembered her name years later, under circumstances that had nothing to do with retail. None of this, the reputation, the family, the decade of showing up, bought her anything on June 23, 2026. Because the man walking toward her register that morning didn't know any of it, didn't know her name, didn't know her sons' names, didn't know she was the reason a Dollar General on Victory Drive ran better than it had any right to. He knew none of it, and in about 90 seconds, none of it would matter. 10:45 a.m., 3 minutes after the shot, Muskogee County Deputy Coroner Dustin Harrelson pronounces her dead at the scene, not at a hospital, not in an ambulance. Behind the counter she was standing, at 90 seconds earlier. Cause: a single gunshot wound, close range. The register is untouched, no cash missing, no drawer forced. Whatever this was, it wasn't a robbery. And that distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because it eliminates the one motive that would have made this simple. Columbus PD locks the store down. Full crime scene protocol. Photograph everything before it moves. Recover the shell casings. Tag the cash still sitting on the counter. Evidence now, not currency. Every camera in that store gets pulled, and this store had cameras. Multiple angles. A clear shot of the register, the door, The parking lot. That changes everything about how fast this moves. In cases without footage, investigators build a suspect from fragments, partial descriptions, inconsistent witness accounts, days of legwork before a name even enters the conversation. Here, they don't need to build anything. They need a face, a direction of travel, and a description broadcast before he's gotten more than a few blocks away. The footage gives them all three. Whoever walked out of that store on foot or drove out of that parking lot is now the single most wanted man in Columbus, Georgia, and he doesn't know it yet. Dollar General's statement comes down hours later. Corporate language, carefully worded, deeply saddened over the tragic loss of our Columbus store manager. The store closes indefinitely. Grief counselors get called in for the staff still processing what they watched happen feet away from them. But corporate statements don't answer anything. They don't say who he was. They don't say why. They don't say how a man capable of this walked into a Dollar General on a Tuesday morning and out again, like nothing happened. Columbus PD has the footage. They have the description. Now it's a matter of how long it takes to catch him, and what happens the moment they do. 11:40 a.m., 55 minutes after the shot. Columbus PD has a name now. Jerome Willis, 33 years old. And they have a location. A parking lot in the 3800 block of Baker Plaza Drive. A residential stretch a few miles from the store he walked out of, less than an hour earlier. He's not hiding. He's not running. He's just standing there. Officers move in and give verbal commands. Standard procedure. Identify yourself, show your hands, comply. He doesn't. This is the moment departments train for specifically to avoid escalation. Officers release the K9, Havoc, 2 years old, a German Shepherd, trained to close distance on an armed suspect, faster and safer than a human officer can. The dog is the de-escalation option. Send Havoc in, contain the suspect, avoid a shootout entirely. Willis doesn't let that happen. He pulls the gun and fires. Not at an officer first, at the dog. Then he turns the weapon on the officers themselves and keeps it raised, keeps it pointed, refuses every opportunity to put it down. Officers return fire. 1:16 p.m. Jerome Willis is pronounced dead at the scene. 2 hours and 34 minutes. That's the entire span. From a $1.58 transaction to a dead suspect in a residential parking lot. One officer shot, expected to recover fully. Havoc, hit and bleeding, loaded onto a medevac flight to a veterinary trauma unit in Auburn, Alabama. His survival uncertain for hours. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation takes over immediately. Not the homicide, the shooting itself. Anytime a Georgia officer uses deadly force, an outside agency has to review it independently. Willis's body goes to the GBI crime lab. Autopsy pending. On paper, the case is closed within 3 hours. Suspect identified, located, neutralized. But closed isn't the same as explained. Because here's what nobody at that press conference is saying yet. This wasn't Jerome Willis's first contact with Georgia law enforcement. Not close to it. There's a record here. Arrests, convictions, prison time. That stretches back almost 20 years. And one detail in that record, once you see the date next to it, turns this entire case into something much harder to look away from. If you're the kind of person who needs to know exactly how deep that record goes, and exactly what it means about the system that put him back on that street, hit subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear next is the part of this case nobody's actually reported in full. Muscogee County. Jerome Willis is a juvenile, and he's already looking at a robbery conviction. The sentence, 20 years, 10 to serve. That number matters. 10 years, for a teenager, isn't a warning shot. It's a system deciding early that this person represents a serious risk, and it's the first entry in a file that's about to get a lot longer. He's back in the system. Robbery again, then aggravated assault, then obstruction of law enforcement officers, the charge that shows up when someone doesn't comply with police, when a routine stop turns into something that requires force to resolve, then terroristic threats. Each one of those is a separate arrest, a separate court date, a separate moment where a judge, a prosecutor, a parole officer had Jerome Willis's file open on a desk, and made a decision about what to do with him. Terroristic threats again. Convicted. 2 more years, added to his time in custody. This isn't a man with one bad decision in his past. This is a documented pattern. Nearly 2 decades of escalating contact with the legal system, spanning robbery, violence, and threats serious enough to keep landing him back in custody. Here's the date that changes how you have to look at everything that follows. May 21st, 2026. Georgia Department of Corrections records mark Jerome Willis released from Dooley State Prison. Same date, his file goes inactive in the state system. Free. Out. Nothing pending. Alexis Hill is killed on June 23, 2026. 33 days. That's the entire window between Jerome Willis walking out of a state prison and walking into a Dollar General with a loaded gun. 33 days to find housing, figure out an income, rebuild something resembling a life after serving time. And somewhere inside that window, whatever happens, happens. Investigators haven't released what those 33 days looked like. No timeline of his movements. No account of who he was in contact with, where he was staying, what, if anything, was escalating in the weeks before June 23rd. What's not missing is the reaction from the one person who might have seen something. His father spoke to local media after the shooting, and what he said wasn't a defense. He said he hadn't been convinced yet that his son was the one who killed her, that he wanted to see the evidence himself before accepting it. Then he said something else, that Jerome had struggled with mental health issues, that he believed those struggles were part of why his son reacted the way he did once police were behind him. He was careful with his words. He wasn't excusing what happened. He was trying to explain a version of his son that the court record alone doesn't show. But here's what the record does show. Without interpretation, without anyone's opinion attached to it, a man with a documented history of violence and threats going back to his teenage years, released from state custody, and inside of 5 weeks, standing across a checkout counter from a woman he had never met. Nobody flagged that gap. Nobody intervened in it. And the record doesn't say why. Every state release process runs on the same premise. Risk gets assessed before the door opens. Someone with Jerome Willis's file, robbery as a juvenile, aggravated assault, obstruction, terroristic threats twice, doesn't just walk out of Dooley State Prison unreviewed. Georgia's system is built to flag exactly this kind of record. Supervision conditions, reporting requirements, mental health follow-up, if it's warranted. That process exists specifically to catch people who are statistically likely to reoffend, before they do. So the question isn't whether a process existed, it's what that process actually produced in Jerome Willis's case. And right now, the public record doesn't say. There's no confirmation of what supervision, if any, applied to him after May 21st. No confirmation of mandated check-ins. No confirmation of whether his documented mental health history triggered any kind of follow-up requirement at all. What exists instead is a release date, and 33 days later, a homicide. That gap, between what a system is designed to catch and what actually happened on the ground, isn't unique to this case. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in cases exactly like this one, where a documented risk doesn't disappear just because a sentence technically ends. None of this excuses what Jerome Willis did inside that Dollar General. Nothing does. But it reframes the question this case is actually asking. Not, how did a violent man end up at that register? That part is simple. He walked there. The real question is how a man with 15 years of documented, escalating violence was standing on a public street, unsupervised in any way anyone can currently confirm, little more than a month after leaving prison. That question doesn't have an answer yet, and it might not get one. Start with what this wasn't. It wasn't a robbery. The register was untouched. Willis left his own purchase, the hamburger buns, sitting on the counter. A man robbing a store doesn't leave without the cash and without his own change. It wasn't personal. Investigators checked. Alexis Hill and Jerome Willis had no prior relationship, no shared history, no dispute, no debt, no connection anyone has been able to find between the two of them, ever, before that morning. It wasn't targeted at the store itself. No history of complaints, No prior incidents involving Willis at that location. Nothing on record tying him to that Dollar General before June 23rd. Investigators have systematically closed off every motive that would make this make sense. What's left is the version that's harder to sit with. A man with no connection to her, no plan involving her specifically, made a decision in the time it takes to hand over $2 bills, and there was nothing about that interaction that anyone could have predicted or prevented from where she was standing. That's not a motive, that's an absence of one. As of this recording, investigators have not released a determined motive. The GBI's review into the officer's shooting runs alongside the homicide case, and both remain open. It's possible something surfaces later, a phone record, a message, a conversation with someone who knew him during those 33 days. It's also possible nothing does, because the only person who could explain why he chose that store, that morning, that specific stranger, is the same person officers shot dead in a parking lot 2 hours later. Whatever answer exists, it left with him. The Dollar General on Victory Drive stays closed for days. Not because the investigation demands it. The physical evidence is already collected, cataloged, gone. It stays closed because the people who work there can't walk back in yet. Grief counselors get called in. Employees who watched it happen, or walked in minutes after, aren't being asked to restock shelves. Outside, the memorial starts building before anyone organizes it. Flowers, cards, items left by people who never worked with Alexis Hill, never met her, but recognized her name from the counter they'd walked up to 100 times. Jonathan Hill moves fast. Within days, he sets up a fundraiser. Not for himself, for the costs nobody plans for. Memorial service, burial, travel for family flying in from out of town. In his post, he calls her a beloved sister and friend whose sudden death left the family heartbroken, and asks the community to help her get the send-off she deserves. He adds a warning. Other fundraisers are already circulating, unauthorized, using her name. Only his is real. The response doesn't wait for permission. Da Funnel Cake Factory, a restaurant on Fort Benning Road, announces it's donating a share of an entire week's proceeds directly to the Hill family. Their post doesn't dress it up. This is our community, good, bad, or indifferent. They host a prayer vigil. Candles on a sidewalk. For a woman most of the people there knew only as the manager who remembered their name. Days later, the Columbus Riverwalk fills with people releasing balloons in her memory. Jonathan Hill speaks. And what comes out isn't composed. He says he's cried more in 4 days than in his entire life. Says he's totally destroyed. But even here, even at his lowest point in public, he does something specific. He asks the community not to target Willis's family, not to turn this into retaliation, aimed at people who didn't pull the trigger. He frames it through his faith, not through anger. A choice that costs him something, visibly, in the moment he's making it. Southside Baptist Church Associate Pastor Elias Claes speaks to what this did to the wider community. Not just Alexis's 3 sons, but every parent in Columbus who pictured their own kids in that same position and couldn't finish the thought. Her celebration of life is set for July 3rd at Cathedral of Prayer, Kojic. A community choir assembles specifically to sing for her, people who didn't know her personally, showing up anyway. The system resolved this case in under 3 hours. The people she left behind are still nowhere near finished. There will be no trial, no arraignment, no jury selection, no prosecutor laying out evidence piece by piece while a defense attorney tries to poke holes in it. No moment where Jerome Willis has to sit in a courtroom and account for what he did, because he's dead. Shot 2 hours after he pulled the trigger, in a parking lot 3 miles from where it started. That's not how this channel usually ends a case. Usually, there's a verdict, a sentence, some version of a system working through to a conclusion you can point to. Here, the case closes the same day it opens. Homicide, manhunt, resolution, all inside one afternoon. What that means is simple, and it's worth sitting with. The only record of what happened inside that Dollar General comes from evidence and witnesses, not from him. He never had to explain it, because he never had the chance to, and now he never will. The GBI's file on the officer-involved shooting will close eventually, An autopsy report, an investigative summary, no courtroom transcript, because there was no courtroom. Legally, this case resolved in under 3 hours. Nothing else about it did. Alexis Hill went to work on a Tuesday morning to do a job she'd done for years. At a store she ran better than it had any right to be run. For 3 sons, who are now old enough to know exactly what they lost, and young enough that it will follow them for the rest of their lives. She wasn't a target. She wasn't a statistic waiting to happen. She was standing at a register, doing something ordinary, when a man she'd never met decided, for reasons that left with him, that this was where it would happen. If this case sat with you the way it sat with us, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. Next time on Black Homicide Files, a disappearance that took investigators over 20 years to solve, until one confession changed everything.